So I'll follow you down with the camera running.
I have no idea when this program will be aired on Hometown Cable or any of the other cable systems in the North Country, but it's a beautiful spring day, or spring-like day, as we tape record this program on February 12th, 1999, with temperatures expected to be in the mid-50s. Ah, sweet spring in the North Country with sunshine and very brisk winds. In case those of our viewers are not familiar with the interior of this atrium or this little building, we're inside the Feinberg Library on the campus of Plattsburgh SUNY. Just to give you an idea what this part of the facility looks like, we'll be heading down into the inner sanctum of this building to the special collections, where, if you're a regular viewer, you know we interviewed Dr. Douglas Kopp a few weeks ago and talked about the history of Hawkins Hall and this college campus based on a book he wrote on the subject. We got to look at a great many original photographs and documents, and that was fun. We're going to head down today, and we're going to be speaking with Wayne Miller, whose job it is to handle this special collections. And I'm sure for the average John Q. citizen, they have no clue as to what's housed in this special collection. But for part-time historians such as Calvin and myself, the guy that's handling that camera behind me, it's a delicious collection. This campus is filled with art. Everywhere you go, there's art. Some of it done by people who are involved on the campus as students, but many of them who are distinguished artists in their own right, living and dead. Oh, what a fabulous doorman. How are you, Wayne?
Fine, thank you.
Great. Come on inside. We've been in here before, and as I started to say over the last few moments on our way down here, this special collections, it doesn't even begin to describe what happens here. But Wayne, first of all, let me ask you how long you've been here.
About 2.5 years.
2.5 years. Sit down and rest, because this could take a little time here as we get into this great subject matter. You and I have a common bond we learned very quickly when I walked in the door today, and it dates back to Brushton, New York.
Yes, where your father baptized me.
Isn't that incredible? And you've been keeping track of my newspaper columns, so you know I said one week when I look in the mirror I see more of my father every day.
It happens to all of us, I think, yes. Your father was a wonderful man. I have fond memories of him. I was just a little tyke, obviously, if you baptized me, but I have fond memories of him stopping in the house. And
your mother still mentions about how he always picked supper time.
Oh, yes.
He was very, very good at that.
Oh, yes, and you know, really that was a great time to come, because that's when families come together, and so to minister to the family as a whole and to see how the family was doing, I probably couldn't have picked a better time to stop in.
You know, you and I'm sure, would be very quick to pay tribute to our parents. Your dad, a very colorful personality, an interesting person in the potato chip business in Brushton. My dad, a Methodist minister for well over 50 years. It's a kick to look back in time and see, and to look in the mirror and see some of those qualities that your dad had and my dad had. I'll never forget as a small child. Oh, I forgot. I say a small child, maybe 14 years old, 13 or 14, taking the first tour of that little potato chip factory there in Brushton. That was neat.
Yeah, he always loved showing people around and giving me a little treat, and most people have never had fresh hot potato chips, or you were remembering the peanut brittle, yeah, watching the candy being made, and just having a little scrap was a real treat for most people. Yeah, it was. Well, it's an era past, but you know, as you were reminiscing, we were reminiscing, it also brings to mind how the North Country really is a small community, and we run across each other if we hang around long enough. It's not like the urban environment where people pass on and off into the night and you never see them again. North Country's small enough that we run into each other again.
What a charming way to bring history back, because it goes back It goes back for me more than 44 years. That happens to be 44 years ago when I graduated from the old Moira High School, which was centralized, you informed me, with a new school less than 2 years after that. What year did you graduate?
I graduated in '67. And actually, from what's still called the new school, which of course is 40 years old now.
The new school, like the new base and the old base.
That's right. That's right. Everything's relative. Actually, the voters of Brushton just voted the other day to expand the new school and finally stop using the old Brushton High School, which has been the grade school in Brushton for 40 years. So that's going to be some more big changes. I don't know what they'll call things now. We'll have to see.
The really new school, right?
Well, at least parts of it, yes.
That's neat. I have so many fond memories, and this program is involved with a lot of history. First of all, we like to find out the history of the people we interview and the places we talk about, and in special collections, you're talking about a lot of history. So it's fun to go back in time. Talk about my father. He called himself the old circuit rider because back in those days, the rural preachers, as they were called, had several churches.
Still do.
And still do. And my brother was a minister in North Bangor, where you live now, back in the 70s, and he had 7 churches, including Mountain View and Owl's Head. And when you talk about hinterlands, you're getting up there in the boonies.
Yes, actually, the church in Mountain View is a beautiful little church. I've sung there a few times.
Have you really?
They, of course, are only open in the summertime. The path gets kind of clogged this time of year. But yeah, it's just the inside of it, it's all wainscoted and varnished, and it's a beautiful little church. It only holds about 30 people, and now it's administered from the Methodist Church in Malone, but the clergy in Malone take turns going up there through the summer and preaching. So it really is a community church.
Driving up the Whippleville Road and all the way up on the top of the mountains there is, for me, like driving into the past. Because it has fond memories for me, but many of the old buildings, including that church you just mentioned, are so ancient that you feel like you're in a time machine when you step in the door, aren't you?
Well, and the church in Chasm Falls is well over 100 years old. We're talking, these were communities that really flourished in the second half of the last century, as much of the North Country did, and it has had something less than a stellar economy this century. And so much of the material we have here in Special Collections documents all of the activity, whether it was logging or mining or the railroad building, steamboats on the lake, all of the, when this was a really happening place, all of the activity that went on, which is an era gone by, but it's still important, and many people are interested in it, and it's obviously fruitful for research, just to look on in a general way to see how an area develops and peaks and then kind of goes through some decline and hopefully regenerates.
It's hard to believe, but yes, books have been written about the Owl's Head Mountain View area just because of its unique nature. I remember when Calvin and I were at the Franklin County Fairs, I call it the Malone Fair one time, this gentleman came in with a T-shirt on. I can't remember what it said, Calvin. I don't know if you can remember. Something about but Owl's Head or Mountain View, we used to, even as a youngster, we used to call it the ice box of the North.
Oh yes, well, it was
and it's still
yes, and actually, Floyd Hyde, who's a longtime summer resident of Mountain View, wrote a very good book about water over the dam. Is the name of the book, of course, pointing to the dam at Mountain View, which has been there many years, had some problems during the ice storm, but they've stabilized that, and it should be there for many years to come.
You know, something I can mention in connection with the ice storm, since you brought it up, and since we never do a program without bringing it up because it touched so many people in so many ways, but the higher you go, the less damage there was, and My daughter Sharon and son-in-law Galen Pavone, Galen's taught at the high school here for many, many years, bought a camp in a little place way farther past that, on a little place called Drain Pond.
Oh, yes, I know.
And the reason it's called Drain Pond goes back to the old logging days and so on. It's a beautiful spot. But the first thing I noticed when I went up there is that very few trees were damaged by the ice storm.
Mm-hmm. Now, on the east side of the mountains, the Wilmington area, the altitude was critical, but it didn't seem to have any particular pattern from what I've seen driving around. But on the north side, it very definitely, the first 2 days that Malone, Bangor, Brushton along Route 11 had ice, St. Regis Falls, for example, with just a few more 100 feet in altitude, they had rain. So it didn't build as much there. They ended up with some damage, but they had power for a couple of days longer. They had school for a day or two after all the schools out of the foothills were closed down. Yeah, you're right that the altitude seemed to be critical, and I guess as you really got down into the valley. It looked like it all was pretty damaged to me, but I've had some friends and relatives who claim that Malone and along Route 11 were the worst hit. Messina wasn't as badly damaged because they're down more in the valley. I'm not sure if that's really true. Messina people would probably disagree, but yeah,
it was pretty devastating all the way around is what we're trying to point out, but there were pockets and places that were less seriously damaged than others, and that's okay too, because the recovery's still not complete for many areas in the ice storm. I might mention, I mentioned the Whippleville Road because I like to say it. It's like the Peasleeville Road, the Whippleville Road, and places like Frog Hollow and other charming spots that I visited over the years.
Bull Run.
And Bull Run. But the Whippleville Road, a good friend of mine, Mark Flick, who's a youngster that grew up in our community in Morrisonville, who lives on the Whippleville Road with his wife, who's taught at the Moira Brushton School for years, and good friends. And so we love to go down there and see their kids and talk about our kids and many, many years ago. Mm-hmm. When you get old, you tend to reminisce a little more than usual because we have more things to remember. And as I get older, the harder it is to remember some of those things. But you just brought back a flood of memories about your mom and dad and the old days back then. That was great.
Yeah,
so where did you go when you left there in the 60s?
Well, I went to college in Rochester, the University of Rochester, and got a degree in history. I worked my way through as a cook, working summers in Lake Placid and around.
Did you really?
And I got out in 1971, the height of the Vietnam War, with the economy kind of geared up for that and not really doing a lot of hiring of college graduates. And I was still a cook, so I worked 4 or 5 years as a cook, and then
what's wrong with that profession, I'll tell you.
well, it has good and bad side effects.
Yeah.
I worked at the old homestead up in Lake Placid one year, where the Hilton is now, which was a wonderful old place.
Boy.
It was the whole place was an antique, and then in the mid-'70s, I went to Oswego to get a master's degree in American history and wrote a thesis on the founding of Akwesasne and all of the border arguments that happened between Britain and the United States until it was finally straightened out in the 1830s. And while I was doing that master's degree, I volunteered in the library at Oswego in the special collections there, and had a chance to work with some manuscripts of some Indian agents and different people from former President Millard Fillmore. Some of his papers are there. And I really enjoyed that, and made the decision then that I would really look into librarianship as a career. So my wife, we weren't married at that point, was working at Penn State University. So I went down to Penn State and got a part-time job on the loading dock at Penn State Library, and that gave me a chance to see the inner workings of a large library, and I really liked what I saw. So I went to library school in Geneseo, and when I first graduated, came back to Malone and wrote a book as a as a grant project on the history of Franklin County and a statistical history of it. Then I worked for 5 years as the senior medical librarian to the St. Lawrence Psychiatric Center in Ogdensburg, ran the medical library and the patient's library, which is like a little public library. I went from there back to my home ground and was for 11 years the high school librarian at Brushton Myers Central. And went through a building project, among other things there, to expand the size of the library and introduce computers, and got the library online and on the internet. And 3 years ago, when this opportunity arose to use my interest in history and my background working with manuscripts, I decided to take the plunge and make the drive from Malone, and I haven't regretted it for a second. I really enjoy working here.
That's great. So you still make your home right there in North Bangor?
Right. Well, actually, it's on a farm. It's on the farm where my wife grew up, between North Bangor and Malone.
Come on.
Great place for the kids to run around,
Oh, that's wonderful.
and plenty of room for my garden. So,
Gardens are important. Boy, that's a big part of it.
yeah. Well, it's gets you out there and in the fresh air, and I really find it's a good when you're working with people all day in public service and working with old fragile materials. We have to be really careful. It's great to get out the garden and pull some weeds out and throw some stones around and muck about, and it's also a great foil for when many of us, like yourself, working in public service. Now you're going to end up with this program as a product, and you can look at it and you know what you've produced. But many times, librarians especially, if we do our job right, the client, the patron, gets what they need and they leave. And you have some self-satisfaction, but if somebody walks up to you and says, when I get home at night and my kids say, "How was your day, Dad? What'd you do today?" It's kind of hard to explain. You can't really show it to them. But if you get out in the garden and you grow a good tomato or cucumbber, nobody can argue.
People.
That's right. Oh, and I do. I bring some of the extras in and share. Well, tomatoes, they say, are the most overgrown vegetable in the world, and so we all love them, but we all plant too many of them.
Oh, of course. Share the wealth.
That's right.
Sure. Why don't you give me a zucchini? I'll give you a tomato.
Well, the zucchini, maybe I'll trade you a cucumber for it.
But there is something about this North Country that's like a magnet. It kept you here and brought you back, and did the same for me.
Yep, that's very true. And when I was at Penn State, which is in a very rural area, one of the things I realized was that first, after living in some cities, I really preferred living in a rural area. And secondly, the nature of rural areas being as, call it conservative, if you will, traditional, while we're very friendly and on the surface we're very accepting of new people, the community is so stable that it takes 2 or 3 generations to not be a newcomer. And I realized that if I really wanted to be a part of a rural community, it had to be the one where I started out.
That's great. What a great feeling, and you'll never regret it.
Oh no,
You have it now, and you never will.
And I've given it to my children too. They don't have to choose to live here, but if they want to, they have their roots.
And they'll always come back. I know they will.
People seem to cycle around. It is amazing. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about special collections. I'm sure a great many of our viewers out there have no idea what the term means and what you have here. We can't give the definition in a few words, so we're going to take a look around, but whet our appetites.
Well, special is a catch-all phrase. And basically, things that don't fit into the general collection in the bulk of Feinberg Library end up in special collections. It has a further emphasis that it is particularly interested in regional materials. And in fact, when it was first formed a little over 30 years ago, it was called the Center for North Country Historical Research. And many of the materials that we have are history materials, but we're certainly not exclusively a history collection. We have medical materials, geology, law books that some of them are 200 years old. Actually, we had a donation from a retired faculty member last year of a legal book that's about 400 years old.
Oh, isn't that neat?
Written in Latin.
I love it. Oh, wow.
And published in London in the late 1600s. It's really a general collection with a specific emphasis. In other words, we have books on all subjects, but primarily books that relate in some way to the northeast corner of New York, Lake Champlain, the Adirondacks, the Champlain Valley into Vermont and southern Quebec. And we have material in various formats, which means besides books and magazines, we have photographs, movies, videotapes, photographic slides, pamphlets. We clip a lot of newspaper articles. We have some actual newspapers that are close to 200 years old. We have some of the newspapers that reported on the Battle of Plattsburgh in the Albany newspaper, for example.
I'll tell your buddy from Vermont, Calvin, we have a friend over there that collects old newspapers, and he's trying to make the entire collection for the War of 1812.
Well, we'd be happy to share copies of them, but
he's a neat guy. Of course, anything old become collectibles, and this guy gets online, and there are people who deal in old newspapers.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, he'll go crazy just to come and walk around down there, as we all would.
Well, and one of the things we're working on, because we can only be in one location physically, and people have to come to us, one of the things we're attempting to do is make our materials more available by putting them online. And we're just finishing a project to put our collection guides, because one format I didn't mention already, that's a big part of this collection are manuscript.
Oh, yeah.
We have lots of letters, diaries, journals, various kinds of original documents, some of them of local governments, some of them of, we have some of General Benjamin Moore's, the commander at the Battle of Plattsburgh, some of letters to him and from him. There are a few that are particularly interesting to me that were from a spy of his who's a fairly famous fellow. He's often referred to as the Lost Dauphin.
Of course.
Eliezer Williams.
The old building outside the res is gone now. Remember that old...
Well, no, that's there. It was remade.
Was it?
Fixed up, yeah. It's sort of probably the oldest A-frame in the world. Yeah. No, that's gone through several incarnations. It was a youth hostel for a while. It's back to being a private residence.
Is it recognizable anymore? Because it was so charming back when.
It doesn't look as rustic because it's been, shined up and really looks modern. To look at it, you would not think it was a 200-year-old house. But
explain its part in that history for us.
Well, the story goes that this fellow arrived mysteriously in Akwesasne in the late 1700s. And within about a year of the beginning of the French Revolution, when Marie Antoinette told them to eat cake, and they decided to decapitate her instead. And there is some evidence to suggest that some of her children escaped. And this fellow arrived at about the right time to have escaped France and claimed to be the heir to the French throne, or Dauphin, the lost Dauphin, and lived there for many years, was a preacher, and the name he was called was Reverend Eliezer Williams. some books have been written about him, a really interesting historical figure. No real hard evidence that he was actually the lost Dauphin, but a great story. But what is true is that in the early 1800s, Native Americans held, and particularly the Iroquois, held the balance of power in North America, first between the English and the French, and then between the Americans and the British in Canada. They were, even though somewhat demoralized by the changes that had occurred around them at the end of the 1700s, and having been involved in treaties that are still the subject of court battles that reduce the size of their lands to the current relatively small reservation. The Iroquois, the Mohawk at Akwesasne were an important force, military force, a consideration. So General Moores wanted to know very much what their attitude was toward the hostilities in the War of 1812. And he employed Reverend Williams to be a spy. That's the word. An informant, military intelligence. And we have some letters where Reverend Williams came over to Plattsburgh and met with the general, and then on his way back stayed overnight in Chateauguay and wrote a letter complaining about how lousy the roads were. And
Gee, sounds like some letters we get these days.
well, not quite as much mud these days as they had then. And then some letters from the area, from Akwesasne and from French's Mills, as Fort Covington was known in those days, talking about what was going on in the community there and what the attitude, and basically saying his assessment, the Reverend's assessment, was that they would stay out of the fray and stand back and watch and see what happened with the invasions back and forth. Because, of course, not only did the British invade the United States more than once during the War of 1812, but the Americans invaded Canada with less than sterling results, too. It's been surprising to me as I've become more and more familiar with the details of those campaigns, that in Canada, the Battle of Chateauguay, now we're talking Chateauguay, Quebec, is seen as a very important historical event in Canadian history, and is taught to public school children in Canada. It's in the textbooks there, and it really is unfortunate that the Battle of Plattsburgh has not been recognized in this country for the importance that it played in what is sort of a forgotten war. War of 1812 is sort of an asterisk in most history textbooks.
It's stated very well, an asterisk, and I think that may be changing if certain people that we've interviewed numerous times, and if events of the last few years spotlighting the battle and its place in history have anything to do with future, I think we may be in a few more textbooks.
Yeah, I think you're right, and rightly so. While Special Collections has not been directly involved in the various committees that are working, we are certainly at least sympathetic, and we're in the process now of trying to obtain some grant monies in cooperation with the Kent Delord House and the Clinton County Historical Society and the public library system and Plattsburgh Public Library to create a Battle of Plattsburgh website. Where we would scan, something like Reverend Williams' letters, scan them, put them on the web.
Wonderful start, huh?
Yeah. Well, there are researchers literally all over the country who are writing, researching this. We've been sending photocopies of materials to. There's a professor at the University of Mississippi, and there are some others around the country who sort of in anticipation of the bicentennial of the War of 1812, are re-examining that conflict and preparing new books on the subject. And so the idea of making these materials again accessible outside the confines of the walls of special collections means that we can provide more service to more people, and they don't have to work as hard to get access to it.
I like the idea of networking the resources from the various groups you just mentioned. Sometimes we operate as separate entities when I think we should be working towards some of the same goals. I think you just stated that very well, too.
Well, and really, this grant that we're writing, the Battle of Plattsburgh's just an excuse, if you will, a focal point. The real thrust of the proposal is a model program of cooperation among the various historical agencies. And one of the results that we hope for is to further promote heritage tourism, as the Chamber of Commerce and other groups in the region have been attempting to do. The more we can make people aware that we're here and that we have things that are at least interesting, if not valuable, from a research standpoint, the more we can attract people into the area, more we can excite people right here that have no idea of the rich heritage that we have.
That's why we're sitting here today with these cameras rolling. One of our biggest hue and cries on this program, and in the previous 36 years I spent in the radio business, was to talk about heritage tourism. And in raising my kids, when we couldn't afford to go to some of the high-profile places that we don't have to mention today, we would head for the historical spots and walk in the woods with shovels and metal detectors and head to the Smithsonian to see what they had there that people might be interested in. And it cost us very little money. And while my kids in those days might say, "Oh, no, not again. Dad's looking at bugs. Let's go somewhere else." Now, 30, 35, 40 years later, they say, "Hey, thanks for doing that with us."
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The glitz of the amusement parks excite children, but it just leaves them with a visceral response. Their blood pressure goes up, they're excited, but you walk away and what do you have? If a child goes to a museum, it may not necessarily cause sparks to fly in their excitement, but it's a learning experience, it's enjoyable, and it's something that will stick with them. And it also, I think, gives them a more realistic view of life. Now, you raised your kids with less than $1 million each. And I think you did them a service in another way, too. I think that by giving children so many material goods, so much affluence, we are raising adults who will have such high expectations out of life that they'll never be able to meet them. Could you imagine being married to someone who was used to living in the lap of luxury, and what pressure that would put on you to keep them in the style to which they were accustomed? And if the more one has, the more one expects. So making do with a little less, I think is, personally, I think is a virtue.
There are lots of, what we're saying is there are lots of delicious things that aren't made in those bakeries that we talked about so many times.
Well,
Your history as a, I mean, we both have had our share of delicious things.
Yeah, when you're talking about bakeries, they're a little luxury, I think it's all right.
But you finally found a place to really ply your passion here, haven't you?
Yes,
it's
very
obvious
much.
To me.
Yeah, and I'm very lucky to be following in the footsteps of a number of people who've just done a wonderful job putting this collection together. When you go to the research centers around the country and around the world, most times when you find a significant collection, it's been there for 100 or 300 or 500 years. We're talking about a collection that's 30 years old, but is already becoming mature, that it has a lot of valuable materials in it, a lot of unique materials. And The people that were involved in putting this together, including people like Glenn Evans and Stan Ransom and the recently deceased Dr. Everest, and Connie Pope and Phyllis Wells and a good bunch of people who just did a outstanding job collecting and organizing this material. And I followed Joe Sweeney here, who I'll be always indebted to for doing as much organization and creation of access tools as I have to work with. And I started to mention before, the manuscripts are, in some senses, a little bit of a nightmare for a librarian to organize. Librarians love to organize things, create card catalogs so you can walk right to the specific item and walk in any library in the world and use it the same way. Manuscripts, they create some special problems. And one of the ways that manuscript collections archives have dealt with that access problem is to create something called a collection guide. Now, typically when a family or an organization places their papers here for safekeeping and preservation and to allow researchers access to those materials, they will come in a box or 5 boxes, and we call that a collection. It's the Smith family collection, the Gordy Little collection. And we attempt to do as little rearrangement of the materials as possible. But we do want to enable researchers to find materials that they are looking for. So as well as creating some card catalog entries, when we have time, and oftentimes it's student and interns that create these collection guides, which are a few pages long. We'll give some background about the people who created the collection, place the collection in historical context, add some bibliographic information of other books that might give information that relates to the people in the organization that created that collection, and then gives a fairly detailed listing of what's in it, folder by folder. Because we do repackage the materials to preserve them. And I'll address that in a moment, the collection guides, which have been typed up over the years and fill 3 large notebooks, 3 ring binders, and number somewhere in the range of 75 collection guides, have been something that we've used here on the premises. But again, to make them accessible to people, we're just finishing mounting those collection guides on the World Wide Web as part of the Special Collections web page, which all branches off of the Plattsburgh web page. And for your viewers who have internet access, if they just go to www.plattsburgh.edu and follow the links to library and to Feinberg Library, they'll get to special collections, and there are links there to these collection guides, as well as links to a number of other genealogical resources. Much of the research that is done here by people from off campus, which constitutes about half our business.
Does it really?
Oh yes.
Wow.
It's especially in the summertime and early fall when people are out traveling around the country. We'll get inquiries prior to that, and people will plan their vacations literally to make it here to do research.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So about these half of our customers that are off campus and spread literally anywhere in the world can now do some fairly detailed researching of what materials we hold without having to physically travel here. Yes, and on the other big thing that we have on the internet at the moment is an index to our cemetery listings. That
I didn't know that was on the web.
Yeah,
Wow.
the index to it is.
Yeah,
The index to it was actually done by a fellow from Florida who has some local connections, who put it up. It's getting close to 3 years ago now. It was just around the time that I began here. And we receive about between 5 and 10 letters a week, literally from all around the globe, people asking for photocopies of the full records of the cemetery records so that they're researching their families. And so we'll forever be indebted to the McClellan family from Champlain, who
Legendary.
did an incredible job. We have 125 three-ring notebooks here.
Did you get that number? 125.
And there are another 50-some at the Historical Society in St. Albans that have a lot of the Vermont material in them. All neatly typed up, cross-referenced, indexed.
Can you imagine just thinking about starting a project like that?
It's daunting, to say the least, daunting. And we have virtually all the cemeteries. There are a couple of exceptions of Clinton County cemeteries that the McClellans and a few of their cohorts collected this information. We have some cemeteries in Franklin County, some in Essex County, some into southern Quebec, a few other odd ones around. And the index for the Clinton County listings has been scanned and mounted on the web so people can research it. And then they're given instructions to send us a stamped self-addressed envelope and
Always the stamp self-addressed envelope.
and a fee to cover the photocopying, and we get about 5 or 10 of those a week. And what's been surprising to me is I've got a little bit of, as you mentioned before, growing up in business, a little bit of background in marketing, and in most instances when you market something, you'll see an initial surge of excitement and activity, and then it will gradually taper off over time. This has had an immediate impact. You know, the first week it was on there, we started getting requests for information.
And it grows.
It has remained. It quickly got to this level of 5 or 10 a week. Within 2 or 3 weeks, it was at that level, and has remained at that level. Occasionally, there's a week where you'll get none, and you think, well, maybe it's tapering off. No, it must have been a holiday or bad weather or something. People were busy doing other things, and the next week, there are more letters, more requests there.
And I should interject here that there are a lot of genealogical rip-offs on the internet. And people are very wary, and they're taking in and spending thousands of dollars to set up programs which are ultimately of very little benefit. And this is one of those real things.
Well, we hope to provide a good service at a minimal cost. Obviously, as a college, providing genealogical information isn't the first mission of Plattsburgh State, but we're also a service organization, and this is one of the ways we can serve the community, both the immediate area and the community of people that have some kind of tie to the region. So we're very happy to have the materials here, and we're glad that they're at least access to the information in them is being made available to people everywhere. And I really think that the mere presence of the index on the net has generated some heritage tourism, people coming here. If we've got the cemetery index, maybe we have some other things, which in fact we often do. Because we've collected, of course, a lot of other things besides just those indexes. Although that's a pretty sizable piece of information there, a great resource.
You get the juices flowing here with me, and I hope in turn generate a little bit of that excitement for history among some of our viewers in the North Country who think of a library as a place where they go and look at books. But you've covered just about every medium there is, and you're adding, as new ones are added, you're getting into the digital age right here, too.
Oh, yes. Now, unfortunately, it seems that love of books is sort of a dying passion with most young people, especially. And it presents some challenges for librarians to keep books real and useful and used by our patrons. And obviously sitting down at a computer at home and keying in a few words and having the full text of some journal article that is just exactly what you want is a great thing. But books still have their place. I mean, they've been predicting the death of the book for several decades now, and it hasn't happened.
And it never will. And I should mention that reading recent interviews with Grisham and Stephen King and Danielle Steele and those folks who do pretty well in a country that supposedly doesn't read.
Well, you know, one of the technologies that is being cussed and discussed at library conferences these days are the nearness on the horizon of the electronic book. And whether it's John Grisham or Danielle Steele, and you pop some kind of a storage device, whether it's a CD or a diskette, into your electronic book and you read it on the screen. Somehow, sitting in front of the fire or in the bathtub,
On the beach.
with an electronic book,
No,
doesn't have the
in
same
a log cabin in Mountain View.
Well, and I heard a speaker at a conference last year talking about his copy of a book from his childhood that he treasures more than any of his other possessions, not only because he enjoyed the book and it has meaning for him, but the pencil marks that he made in the margin mean that that book has a direct tie to him. And in many cases here, the materials we have, the manuscript, the fact that something is in General Moore's handwriting or one of the Platt family or any of the early settlers or businessmen here. We have, for example, the records of the Peru Iron and Steel Company, which operated in the last century in the southern part of this county and northern part of Essex County. And Dr. Pollard, an anthropology professor here, has for several years been working not only on site Clintonville and Arnold Hill and around to excavate and document and examine what was there and how this industry evolved. But we have the written records of the company here. So his students and Dr. Pollard too go from the site and seeing what the factory looked like, and they come back here and they've got the books that has the names of all the employees and what they were paid and what they bought at the company store, and so it really adds a fullness, a richness to the picture that these students can gain about what life was like in the mill 100, 150 years ago. And in turn, it allows them as researchers to relate more accurately, more fully to the rest of us what that life was like.
Are there missing pieces? I mean, you're putting puzzles together every day here. History is putting puzzles together. And it's amazing. People like you working in a place like Plattsburgh, New York, and special collections at Feinberg are able to discover a piece of the puzzle, something in somebody's attic. We live in a rural area. We've talked about people living in the same houses for 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 generations. And all of a sudden, one of the young people who works in the probation department with me was leaving his house, cleaning things out, and discovered some old postcards from this area from 1911 and a menu for a banquet that happened in 1917, an organization that no one I can find has ever heard of. So we're putting those puzzles together, and that's got to be a big kick for you, because there's stuff out there. There's stuff on the bottom of the lake. There's stuff under the ground. But there's stuff in attics and cellars and inside people's walls.
Oh yes, it'd be uncovered all the time. Well, really, to steal from Gone with the Wind, we're dependent on the kindness of strangers.
Yes, we are.
And clearly, we don't have the staff or the money to go to Christie's auction house and purchase these collections, which is where they end up sometimes. These days, a Civil War letter doesn't make any difference how insignificant the information in it or it could be a private from nowhere that nothing particularly thrilling happened to. Civil War letters on the market are $100 a piece and up. Now, clearly, we have tens of thousands of pieces of manuscript here, and there is no way that this college could afford nor justify the expenditure of money to collect, to purchase all of these materials. Yet, people have seen fit to place them here because we do offer to preserve the materials, to store them under proper conditions, to organize them in a way that makes them usable to researchers, to family members. I mean, the people who are doing their genealogy research here are looking, in many cases, at letters from their ancestors that were placed here by a family member they never had contact with. And if that family member had not seen fit to put the materials here or cause them to be put here, these connections would never be made. And so, we do very much encourage people to properly care for their heirloom materials, their family records, and if they are unable to or unwilling to care for them any longer, we would very much hope that they would consider placing them here, just as the McClellan family did with their family papers. And incidentally, the cemetery records are only the tip of the iceberg of the McClellan papers. That there's really an amazing collection.
I'm so glad you brought them up, because what a contribution, an inestimable contribution to the North Country, to history.
Oh yes, and the photographs that they accumulated just by themselves are a great collection. They were a pictorial history of, for among other things, the flooding of the Great Chazy River over the past 100+ years. And so if anybody says, well, this has never happened before, as we recall the ice storm and the thing, this is when we've had people come in and not just for the Chazy River, some of the other rivers, when flood damage occurs, and they're trying to convince the federal government or whomever that this is a long-standing problem that ought to be dealt with. We have the records here. We have some records that can help them prove that. We have records that people have used in land disputes, and a few weeks ago we had some people in who were working on restoring the Stone Arch Bridge in Keysville and wanted pictures from the last century to see what kind of guardrails and things were on it, so they could do it in an authentic way. And it's a great learning. I love history, and it's a great opportunity for me to learn more about some of these topics. I didn't know that the Stone Arch Bridge in Keysville was close to 150 years old, and was considered, and may still be, the longest stone arch bridge in the world.
I was just going to say it's unique in that respect, I think.
And the story of its building and it being partially finished and collapsing after a rainstorm with some loss of life, but yet they persevered and finished building this bridge that's now lasted for a century and a half.
That's really, really neat stuff. You mentioned before about preservation, and it's a vital part of what you do, how you preserve the things you get here in these collections.
Mm-hmm. Most of the materials that we collect are on paper. And to understand what problems we're faced with, you need to know a little bit about the history of papermaking. Prior to the Civil War, most paper was made from rags, as our paper money is today, which is very durable and strong, will last for a long time. And one of the reasons that it will last for a long time is that it was made in a process that turned out a paper that was relatively low in acid content. Typically, You took a bunch of rags and you chopped them up a little bit and stuck them in a jar, put some sour milk on them because the lactic acid in the sour milk was sufficient to create a slurry from which you could make paper. Now the Civil War came along, and of course the North's main supply of cloth was the South.
Oh, yeah.
And governments being what they are, the thought of being cut off from their paper supply sent shivers up the spine of every good bureaucrat in the North, which spurred the research and development of the sulfide process of making paper from wood. Now, the only problem with wood is that it's a tougher substance to dissolve, to get into a slurry, and it requires stronger acid, hydrochloric, sulfuric acid, and the resultant paper, unless it's buffered and put through some special processes, the resultant paper has a lot of acid residue in it. Now, the acid's fine as long as it just sits there, but it doesn't just sit there. It gets activated by any one of a number of things: heat, light, moisture, and the acid attacks the fibers. Because paper is, of course, when it's made from cloth, clearly there are threads in it, but there are wood fibers that constitute the paper, and this acid will attack the cellulose fibers and cause them to break, and that's why you get old paper. You pick it up in your hands and it crumbles. In the field, the term often applied is slow fires. And so what we have are virtually all of the materials that were printed, published, written upon since the Civil War are on this high acid paper. And the stuff is literally burning on the shelves. There is a national, even international movement, a lot of work going on to reformat to microfilm, to photocopy onto low acid paper, archival paper, to save this material. But the amount of paper, the amount of knowledge that's printed on this paper is so enormous that we will never be able to save all of it. So the question now is, how do we prioritize? What things do we use our limited time, energy, money, facilities to save? But in the meantime, that's for saving that's going out of existence. What we can do at a relatively low cost to a relatively large amount of material is to stabilize it. So we keep it in conditions where the lights above us here have ultraviolet filters on them. It's the ultraviolet light that activates the acid. We control the temperature in here, and it's going to be a building project that will enable this collection to be even more stable in its temperature. That will be, construction will be starting this summer. We try and keep the humidity as low as possible. We filter out all the sunlight. We even attempt to encapsulate some of the more precious pieces in mylar plastic, so that in handling it, oils and naturally occurring oils, we're all clean, but we all have natural oils in our skin, as the cosmetic commercials will point out, and that gets transferred to the paper and cause some degradation of the paper. So we place the manuscript materials in acid-free folders, in acid-free envelopes, inside acid-free boxes, and as materials present themselves as being used on a fairly regular basis, we will make photocopies of the materials, and whenever possible have our patrons use the photocopy, make photocopies from the photocopy. If they need the original, we have it here, but many times just being able to read the information that's in the original from a photocopy will be sufficient for the researcher's purposes, and then we cut down on the wear and tear on the original.
So when we mention the phrase work in progress, Go ahead, it takes on a new meaning here, doesn't it?
Well, it's never ending, and that's one of the things I like about librarianship. You never run out of things to do. Of course, your first priority is taking care of the customer, the patron walking through the door. But that, you never know one day to the next how many people are going to walk through the door. And whenever you're not busy with a library user, you're processing materials, you're trying to develop better access tools so people can find more materials more quickly, more targeted on exactly what they want. You're letting the public know what you have, not only so that they will be more able to come and use what we have here because they know it exists, but hopefully also to encourage more people to donate their historical artifacts either to this collection or to the museums in the area, which we're very lucky to have the kind of cultural institutions we have in this area that are preserving as much of our history as they can, and we're also then processing those materials as they come in to stabilize them and protect them, preserve them.
Hopefully, somewhere across the great North Country in the far corners of those farmhouses we've just alluded to and mentioned some of them by name, there will be people who say, hey, maybe we've got something that they might like. And you don't know where the next treasure is located, right?
Well, and even if people don't want to part with it, we often have people who will come in and offer to allow us to photocopy. For example, just recently, there's a gentleman who lives in this area who was in temporary possession of a number of Civil War letters from within his family. And he brought them in, and we photocopied them, and we also scanned them with the intention of making those images of those Civil War letters available on the web. He also transcribed them and allowed me to print copies of his transcription, so that even if you can't read the handwriting, you can still find out what's in the letters. And that's great. Our purpose here is to preserve the history, and whether we have the original or a copy, that still means that the information is available, the intellectual content of the material is available. And if the family understandably wants to retain possession of the physical artifact, the original that great-grandpa wrote on, that's perfectly understandable. It's also understandable if they, rather than possessing it in less than ideal conditions, and we can give them a hand with that. I can show people what kinds of materials they need to store things in and how to do that to preserve them as best as can be. But if they don't want that responsibility, or they're no longer able to keep that responsibility, we are very willing to look at the materials with them and ascertain whether this is something of historical significance, and add it to the collections if it is.
Does it frustrate you to think that there are some people out there of all ages who have no interest at all in where they came from or the history of the area they live in?
I don't think it's true that people have no interest. I think that for a good part of their lives, many people are too busy or have too many other interests. But it's a funny thing. You were speaking of my father before. He always had some interest in the family history and passed on what he knew of it and what he had documentation of to me and to my siblings. And when he got ill toward the end of his life, one of the first things he wanted to do, and he dragged my poor mother along with him, to the place of his birth. Now, he was born in a place called Tonganoxie, Kansas.
That's maybe the first and last time the name of that place is ever
No,
mentioned on this film.
Pretty close. So my grandfather was an ice cream maker and actually grew up in Binghamton and learned to make ice cream at the Crowley's plant in Binghamton. And after World War I, he became a journeyman ice cream maker and worked at several milk plants around the country. And happened to be working at the one in Tonganoxie, Kansas, when my father was born.
Remember that, will you?
Spell that, okay?
I love it.
So he dragged my mother to Tonganoxie, Kansas, in the middle of the summer, out in the plains, 100 and whatever degrees, just to go back. And he only lived there till he was 6 months or a year old. So he didn't really have any firsthand memories of it. He had a few snapshots and stories from his parents. But this was important to him. And I think this is, kind of a universal thing that at some point in our life, we need to make sense of our lives and where we fit in. And family is at the center of who we are. So at some point, placing ourselves in the context of not just this generation, but past generations, adds meaning, adds richness to our lives. And there are those who say that the arts, if you will, are what make us human, what give our lives richness, meaning, and so in some sense the understanding of not just genealogy but history and the arts and what's gone before us give us a grounding, give us our place in the world. And so whenever in our lives we slow down enough to think about those things, you get the kids fed and get them chauffeured to where they need to go, and you get the bills paid, and you got a day off from work, you got a quiet moment, and this happens once in a while. These are the kinds of things that people will come upon, that they want to know more about what happened in their house with, for example. We have people come in who want to know that the history of the house they grew up in or where they're living now. So we have business directories of Plattsburgh back to the 1860s, for example, which are very interesting. People aren't familiar with the old directories. They're sort of like a telephone directory, but actually had more information. Each person would not only give their address, but it would give their occupation. And not just their occupation, but their station. So, for example, you could follow somebody, as I was helping someone research a few weeks ago, actually was a member of the McClellan family, who wanted to research the history of the house they grew up in. And one of the former occupants of the house was a fellow in the banking industry here in Plattsburgh, and you could follow over time that he started off for a few years. He was a teller, and then he was an assistant cashier, and moving up the ladder. Yeah. And then he moved. So following the name to see, well, he moved from this street to one a little closer to downtown, and you could kind of see the growth in his career and the changes in his family. Obviously, he moved to a bigger house, and so there's lots of neat things you could do.
So private citizens at one point or another in their life want to see how they fit in. Historians want to see how everything fits in.
Well, yeah, to find the patterns, and of course, like anthropologists, we're looking for patterns. We're looking for want of a better term, the universal truths of what happened at the Battle of Plattsburgh. Why did it happen? A few years ago, there was a big question of exactly where Pike's Cantonment was located.
It wasn't there, though.
Well, and going through the old letters and some of the old maps, each of them are pieces. Sometimes there's a magic bullet. You find one thing that really answers it. But most times it's not quite that easy or clear, and all you can do is collect as much information as you can, see how it fits together, and make your best guess, and point to the evidence to support your argument. So it's A lot of the time I feel a little bit like a Sherlock Holmes, and that's one of the enjoyable parts of the job is tracking down that elusive piece of information that will answer the question, whether it's who was my great-great-grandfather, or where something is, or what's the history of a house, or when was a particular piece of land deeded. Like right now, there's some work going underway. You mentioned the Bicentennial Committee, some work going on to find out exactly who owns the base cemetery.
Oh, good
point. So we have some pieces here. The county clerk has some pieces, probably. The city clerk may have some pieces. And it takes some detective work to pull those things out, make sense of them all, see which ones just really don't fit the pattern, and just because it's written down doesn't mean it's true. And it's great fun. I enjoy the thrill of the hunt, as it will.
That's great. We're in the Feinberg Library Special Collection with Wayne Miller, and our program will continue in just a moment. You don't know it, but we took a little break to collect our thoughts and to take a deep breath. This man is an absolute wealth of information. I really appreciate you having us here today. And we've got a few more things to cover before you get rid of us. But before we do another thing, you have to promise to invite us back.
Oh, glad to have you anytime. And I hope that your viewers will think about stopping in, too.
It's such an exciting place. Before we go any farther, I'd also like to ask when the Special Collections is open, in case people are interested in coming here.
We're open Tuesday morning, 9 to 12, Wednesday and Thursday, 9 to 4, Friday, 10 to 4, and Saturday afternoon, 1 to 5. With the proviso that when the library is closed, like over the Christmas holiday, then Special Collections is closed.
Calvin and I were talking just before you entered the room about how much a part of the history of the North Country this little program is, because Bob Venn did this program for years before he had the bad sense to die on us and we lost him. He did over 500 programs interviewing people such as yourself, but most of them, many of them, historical programs with the area historians, county historians, town historians, hours and hours and hours with Peg Barkham, for example, up in Rouse's Point, on the history of Rouse's Point and the Rouse family. Mm-hmm. Another 6 or 8 hours on the history of the railroads in that area, and what a significant part of North Country history. So when we told Doug Scobb about that, he said, boy, would we love to get some kind of a grant to get copies of those now maybe 600 programs plus the thousands more that Calvin has done since 1983 in the collection here. All videotapes. Wouldn't that be neat?
That would be great. We just really started collecting videotape, and I'm hoping to have a motion picture historian, actually a fellow from California that runs a business that stores the master prints for the film studios, come and do a consulting day with us so that we know we're doing it right. I don't have as much experience with video.
Let us know if we can ever get some access to that, because I have a lot of old 8 and 16 millimeter early films. Calvin has a copy of a movie that was shot on the Bluff, where Clinton Community College is located now.
Really?
A very famous movie that was done in about 1924, we're guessing. Black and white.
I'd love to have a copy.
He tracked it down. He's pretty much of a sleuth when he gets interested, especially in old movies. So I think there could be a Calvin room before we finish at the Feinberg Library. A lot of neat stuff. All right, let's move on here and tell us other things. Now, you told me you have local publications catalog.
Right. What we do is collect as much as we can of local newspapers and magazines, and of course the manuscripts, and to make them accessible so people can find what they want, we index them at the article level. So we go through, we don't index every single article, but if it has some significance to the region, we index it by author and title and the subject matter, and that all those indexing entries are in our card catalog. We're in the process of trying to get that online too, because the library in Rouse's Point has copies of the North Countryman, and we have indexing here. People may have Adirondack Life collections on their shelf, but don't remember which year a particular article they were interested in retrieving.
How many times have we done that?
So we have indexing for all of that stuff here, and this is an ongoing one of our major tasks that my coworker Mike Burgess does most of and supervises the rest. And we think that this is not only valuable for people on campus, but valuable enough for the region that we want to make it more widely available.
That's terrific. And maps.
Oh, we have lots of maps. We have printed maps and manuscript maps. When I speak of manuscript maps, in many cases, these will be like surveyors' maps, site plans, things like that. We have a large collection that was donated by longtime local land surveyor, Mr. Signer. Thousands of maps, and the McClellans collected many maps. I've got a grant application in now to New York State to preserve, encapsulate some of the most significant things that they collected. And they're not all maps in the strict sense. Some of them are designs. For example, there was a company in Champlain, I believe it was Whitehall Laundry, or Whiteside Laundry, and people affiliated with that also manufactured some lanterns and things, and designed other things. And we have a drawing of a design for a fireproof movable movie projection booth. I don't know whether it was ever manufactured, but we have the design. We also have a part of the McClellan collection, a design for what we think may be the first bobsled.
Wow.
The engineer's drawing for that. And so
man,
we say maps, we're basically talking about large format drawings as well as maps. And so the kinds of, and again, we store them in control conditions. This is acid-free paper, and these are acid-free envelopes and folders that materials are stored in. We'll just pull out one here, just to give you an idea. This is a map of Lake George. I'm not sure, I don't see the year on it. Well,
1934 through 39.
okay. And we have many of Lake George and Lake Champlain, as well as through the Adirondack Mountains. We have, for example, there was a fellow by the name of Verplanck Colvin who surveyed the Adirondacks, and each year he submitted the results of his annual survey work to the state legislature, and we have most of his annual reports and the maps that were in them. Interestingly, he used another fellow to take some photographs of his work. His official photographer was a fellow by the name of Seneca Ray Stoddard.
Nobody's ever heard of Seneca Ray.
And we have not only the reports with some of Mr. Stoddard's photographs, but we have prints of some of his other work, as well as copies. I didn't realize till recently, Mr. Stoddard published a monthly magazine for a number of years that always had one of his photographs in it, but also had editorial content written by Mr. Stoddard. So, for example, he, in the 1880s, bemoaning the building of so many dams farther and farther up into the mountains where the yield of electricity was smaller and smaller, and obviously affected fish and wildlife as well as the beauty. And so he was one of the early advocates for some kind of control on development within the park.
Great key names in history here, huh? Let's turn around here and have a look at some of these photographs that you're going to tantalize us with. And I should mention to our viewers that we haven't really taken the grand tour here because we wanted to get a lot of background today, and we got a lot of background, and it's just wonderful. So we'll be back again. What have you got here?
Well, we talked about flooding earlier. Here's a picture, I believe it's on the edge of Lake Champlain. I would have to look it up in the index, and I didn't, of a house that's, well, they don't have to fill the mop bucket to
Probably not.
clean the kitchen floor.
Swim to work in the morning. Oh, boy, look at this.
We've got some
Oh, boy,
photographs
here we
of,
go,
of
Calvin.
the old Army barracks here with the Ken. Here's some of the men practicing. This is in front of the barracks. If you can you see that with some of the ladies and some of the men in uniform. Here's out on the parade ground at the old barracks with I love the stack of cannonballs there.
Great. 1874. Wow.
Now this is a house down on Broad Street. This is the Thomas. I don't have my glasses on, Gordy. Can you?
Thomas Conway home, Broad Street, circa 1910.
Here's some ladies out playing a little lawn tennis.
The Catholic School of America, Cliff Haven, many of our viewers, I'm sure, are not certain of, but it was a prominent place in those days,
it was
into this century.
Yeah, nationally known organization. We have a number of documents related to that, programs and advertisements of their programming there.
A little croquet game going on
croquet
there.
game, yes. Oh, this is just a nice shot of horse and wagon. This is a wagon loaded with ice cream from Plattsburgh, probably around the turn of the century.
Great pictures. Look at this.
A downtown parade. Let's see if we've got the year. No, it doesn't have the year. It's 1903. I'm sorry. This is Clinton Street in Plattsburgh, 1903. The village band is giving a concert.
As they were wont to do.
And this, of course, is the Pepin and Musso livery stable with some of their rigs out front.
Some of the people viewing this, they may be their grandfathers right out there.
Well, could be. The fire station number 1 here in Plattsburgh with some of their equipment and livestock.
I love it.
Don't have a year
Fire
on
Station, Trinity Square.
Don't have a year on that. Now this is the railroad bridge near the Saranac River in Plattsburgh. Here we have another festive occasion with someone wanting to get a bird's eye view up there on the telephone pole.
It says the Third Liberty Loan Gathering in front of the courthouse on Margaret Street, Plattsburgh, New York.
So I guess it was a bank holiday.
Yep.
Another shot. Now this is down at the, I believe that's the post office down there.
That's the old post office, the federal building in
down
downtown Plattsburgh.
Down on Brinkerhoff Street.
Yep.
Here we have
I recognize
dinner in the
this.
dining room at Hotel Champlain.
And we were just talking about the Bluff. The Hotel Champlain, of course, is the current Clinton Community College, which has been a number of things through the years, but it was rather splendid back in those days.
There's
With trolley tracks going almost to the door.
Here's an exterior view of it. About the same time. Of course,
If you haven't been on that campus lately, go up there and take a look at it. It's they've maintained the charm of it even through the architecture in the new Science and Technology building. It's kind of neat.
Well, of course, it was built by the D&H Railroad and
Yep.
was quite a place in its time.
Oh boy.
This is a shot up on Chateauguay Lake. You'll notice the steamboat. And these little huts over here are charcoal kilns. And the Adirondack region was peppered with those to produce charcoal for the iron industry. And typically they would build little spurs of narrow gauge railroad back into the woods, build a couple of kilns, use up the wood that was within easy dragging distance of the kiln, build another spur, This was on the shores of the lake, so they could use the streams around it to float things down, and they could use the lake itself to transport.
Big business, charcoal, big business.
That's
in those
right.
days.
Close. We're really close to Lion Mountain, and of course the forge at the outlet on the north end of Lower Chateauguay Lake, which at one point was the largest Catalan forge in the world. Now, I'm not an expert in smelting, so I don't know what is peculiar about a Catalan forge, but among other claims to fame, the steel cable for the Brooklyn Bridge the ore was mined in Lion Mountain and forged at Chateauguay Forge, carried by horse and wagon down to Chateauguay to put on the railroad. And the designer, the architect of the bridge, came up and supervised some of this himself. And at that time, that was the highest quality spring steel in the world was produced there, and that's why he specified it.
That's kind of amazing.
And here's another shot of Chateauguay Lake with the steamboat. Now, earlier we mentioned the Stone Arch Bridge in Keysville, so I thought I'd pull out a copy of that, and you can see the railings on here, and so this picture was particularly of interest. In doing the research for this, I found in reading some of the histories of it that in most building, you see here's the arch and here's the keystone. In most building of this type, the keystone will be made of a harder substance, a harder stone than the rest of the arch. But that was not true with this bridge, that I believe it's limestone that the keystone was made of, which is actually softer than the granite that the rest of the bridge is made of. So these are just a few. We have literally thousands of photographs. I know during the break you and Calvin were looking through some of the McClellan's photographs.
Just books and books of those alone. Again, if people want to find out more about the McClellans and their legacy, they're welcome to do that.
Oh, yes.
A lot of people's lives were touched directly by this family and indirectly by virtue of the fact that they preserved parts of the North Country history which may have been lost had they not engaged in their lifelong work.
Oh, well, and not only did they just preserve, they actually went out and dug stuff out,
Oh,
and
yeah.
they created a lot of history themselves, but with the cemetery indexes being a prime example of history that they created, information that they collected, manufactured themselves, as well as, of course, their work with the Mooresfield Press and for example, publishing material on Yehudi Ashman, one of the famous sons from the northern part of Clinton County, who was the founder of Liberia and grew up in Champlain. And there's very little in print about this man, and he's an important historical figure. That the McClellans were part of creating a celebration honoring his birth, and we have pictures as part of the McClellan collection that I believe was the 150th anniversary of his birth. They had the ambassador of Liberia. It was a community celebration that went over a weekend. And we have pictures and copies of the programs and things. And they were very much instrumental in organizing that celebration.
What a wonderful collection of things they have in the special collection here. And as you speak, I'm constantly reminded of the incessant battle between preserving history and tearing it down for progress. And somewhere we have to meet in the middle, don't we? Huh?
Well, and
we'd like to tip it toward our side a little bit.
For librarians, it's balancing preservation and access. That if we let everyone, if we pass the stuff around freely and don't take some measures to preserve it, it will be lost. On the other hand, if we just lock it away and never let anybody see it, what good is it? So a librarian's task is to balance that preservation and access, and it parallels with the community with saving the old buildings. Sometimes you can't, but you could save pictures of it. You could save some documentary history of it. Before you tear it down or pave it over, you let the anthropologists or the archaeologists go in and have a few days to muck about and
Fortunately, we have a lot of history of the city of Plattsburgh, and ironically, buildings had to be torn down, wonderful old historic homes, to build this building and other buildings on this campus, at
Very
this
much.
facility.
Yeah, we have some aerial photographs. There used to be a Texaco station down at the corner of Broad and Ruger Street. Yeah, there was some, you're right, there was some, and hospital, the
Sure.
Champlain Valley Hospital.
And the Physicians Hospital.
Physicians Hospital, I'm sorry, yes.
And the Champlain Valley Hospital on this end, which is, part of it is now part of the campus. And we were fortunate enough to discover some ancient film that was shot in the 1920s, inside and outside, with some great night views of the Physicians Hospital. And we tacked it on one of our programs, interviewing people around the extended campus of the CVPH Medical Center now. And that silent film, which Calvin put a little music to, and it had its inherent subtitles, got a great deal of comment when it was on television a couple of weeks ago. So there are neat things all over the place, aren't there?
Well, and we need copies of those for special collections,
Don't
too.
forget, Calvin, if we could get a grant to copy every one of those, if you were to look inside Calvin's house to see the thousands of videotapes, which are so marvelous, and don't you wish you had videotapes of a lot of the significant events in your life, which aren't preserved in any way that you can hear sound? I mean, we wish we had a lot of those things, and in Calvin's case, he does, because he's filmed so many and videoed so many of those significant events in North Country history over the last, since the early 80s. So we're pitching here. As Calvin and I were looking against this wall just before we leave here, we noticed that I knew Calvin was pointing at me, and it was only because our battery was going dead. I thought he was plugged into the wall. As I started to say, Wayne, we just looked at some of the shelves here containing books of the Civil War era, and, you know, I could probably spend the next 10 years of my life sitting at this table and taking out one book at a time. It's just, that's an exciting era.
Yes, we have not only a lot of the standard works that deal with the war as a whole, but we have a lot of the regimental histories, particularly those regiments that were raised in New York State and Vermont. And those are, again, useful for people doing genealogical research, as well as those trying to get a better understanding of some particular aspect of the Civil War. We have a number of local Civil War buffs, historians, including some that are working at the state level to create displays and things down in the Capitol, and they use our materials for that. And we have, in manuscript form, you're looking at the print, we also have manuscript, a lot of Civil War letters from various people around the area, and other things that relate to the Civil War, as we do with the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War, and right up to the present. So if you pulled a book off every day, you would keep up, but we're putting another book on.
No, there's no way. But what a way to OD, huh? What a way to go out, boy, I'll tell you that. It's funny, because as you were talking again, my mind wanders 1,000 miles an hour, and I wrote a couple of columns recently for the local newspaper about buttons and button boxes and how many historic things there are in button boxes. And after writing 2 columns on the subject, and I thought exhausting it, more stories began to pour in. One of the most interesting of which is of a woman who said she had the buttons off her great-grandfather's uniform that was in her great-grandmother's button box and has been handed down as an heirloom from generation to generation. Those are the neat things.
Yeah.
You know?
Now, we wouldn't tend to collect, because that's a three-dimensional object. That's museum territory.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, because we do specialize with the two-dimensional, with the print and the paper-based materials, many of the documents that are owned by the County Historical Society and the Kent Lord House are actually on long-term loan in our collection, because we're better equipped to store them and create the access tools for them.
But as we all work together in that network, and I hope you get that grant you're seeking toward that end, it'll just mean a far greater resource for all of us here, so that we can go place to place and tune in with our past, so we know where we are and maybe get a handle on where we may be going.
Well, it's I think it's interesting, obviously, and I think it's a valuable heritage, as the historian Santayana said, those who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it. And if we can learn from what worked and what didn't work in the past, we should be able to build for a better tomorrow.
Well, that's come to the end of our tape and our program for this time. You'll have to do two things: invite us back, and next time you talk to your mother, give her my best and tell her about the connection we made today. That's one of the neat parts of it for me. I think that's great. You're a super guy, William.
Well, I was glad to renew our acquaintance here after so many decades. And, I'm glad you were able to stop by today.
You can rest assured that we'll be back here. We won't stay away. We'll beat a path to this door. Perhaps many of our viewers will too. Can they telephone, or do they have to make appointments, or how does it work?
No, they don't have to make an appointment. We're open to the public, but if you want to call and check and see if we have a particular kind of information, the phone number is 564-5206. Call anytime. We have voicemail, and we'll get back to you if you call when we're not able to take your call. We can, if it's just a quick question, oftentimes we can look up the answer and just tell it to you over the phone, or
jump on the net and make contact that way.
Exactly. Yeah, we have some of the resources there, and we're getting more all the time. Or you can contact us through the net, and you may want to look at our special collections page, because it's becoming another one of the resources that special collections is able to offer.
Little Wayne Miller from Brushton. Look what he's grown up to be. Huh? What a great meeting it was. Thanks again, sir.
Thanks,
We're in special collections at Feidenberg Library on the campus of Plattsburgh SUNY. Glad you were able to share this time with us. And who knows where